Hello, and welcome to the Everyday Business Problems Podcast. I'm your host, Dave Crysler. Each episode, we talk to business leaders and subject matter experts to learn about the challenges they've overcome and the challenges they still face. You'll hear fresh insights, real talk, and get inspiration to grow your business. Hey everybody, so excited to be welcoming Cody Fisher to the show to kick off a 3-part series on transforming the healthcare supply chain. Cody is the president of Concordance Innovations, where he leads the Surgeon's digital platform and drive strategy across the healthcare supply chain. He's spent his career at the intersection of finance, analytics, and innovation with leadership experience at Concordance, Cardinal Health, and PNC. Cody brings a sharp strategic lens and a practical understanding of how systems and partnerships really work, and I'm excited to be jumping into this conversation. Cody, thanks so much for coming on the Everyday Business Problems Podcast.
Dave, thanks for having me. And I'll be honest, I think I got to steal some of that intro. I love
it. I did my best to, highlight you in a very appropriate way. And yeah, man, I'm really excited to get into this with you. What you all are doing there, and I had the pleasure and opportunity to get a quick peek behind that curtain for a period of time. It really is transformational. I feel like people throw that around these days, like too often. But I can certainly say, having some firsthand experience with it, that what you guys are doing is really transformational. So great to have you on the show.
Absolutely. I'm glad to be here. Wrapping up the end of the year in 2025 with one of my friends. So I'm happy to be here.
Yeah, man. Yeah, it's awesome. So let's dive right into this thing. I want to start by kind of unpacking, since we're going to do a 3-part series. I really tried to be intentional with how we kind of lay this out, because you and I have had a lot of really high level conversations about how all of this stuff works. And, it's just too much to try to unpack in a, 30, 45 minute episode. So, kind of laying some of the groundwork, talking about the real challenges that, folks in this space are faced with. Let's talk about some of the biggest pain points that you're seeing and kind of convinced you and the team, like, something's got to change.
Yeah, you're spot on. It's a lot to unpack. And for those that are listening from the healthcare supply chain, maybe everyone's like, wonder where he's going to start. And how long is it going to take to get through the list? And again, this isn't to kind of shoot anything down or to knock anyone or any organization of what we're doing or not doing in the supply chain. I always start with, it is a complex system. Our supply chain is complex. Supply chains are complex. And we can unpack that, and it's complex to work with partners that are complex. Their organizations are spread out, whether you're a supplier looking at a provider. As you get to know your customers, you start to realize, they don't have one product in one location. They have one product in thousands of locations times thousands of products. Inevitably, that scale just brings in this level of complexity, and vice versa. As a provider in the space, if you look upstream in the supply chain, oftentimes it feels like, well, isn't there just this massive warehouse that has all the manufacturers, all the suppliers' product, and it just comes on trucks to me? It comes in totes, in bags, nicely wrapped. It's like, when you start to unpack all the locations upstream in the supply chain at the distributor and the supplier level, and, you start thinking about boats and trains and rails, and on the other side of oceans, there's locations and plants, and on the other side of plants, there's raw materials and sourcing. And it's like, okay, yeah, it's a web, and that web isn't a straight line, right? So anyways, I start there to kind of, let's start with giving ourselves some grace that it's not easy. It's not easy to move a product along, a web of complex nodes over a 90 to 180 day period, and then be like, oh, did it show up on the exact right day at the exact right time? It's not easy, but it's possible. So if we start there, just kind of let's level set that we do live in a hard, challenging, complex world. And let's be honest, we're living in a world in healthcare where we are not afforded the opportunity to miss that end point. We can't miss the product being there for a surgery. We can't miss the product being there to take care of a clinician, to take care of the patient. There is no delay. And if there is a delay, the impact of that delay isn't a missed sale. It's not missed revenue. I guess if I put my finance hat on, it is, but the real impact of that's far greater than missing revenue. And that is, when we talk in the industry, when we talk to customers, whether that be providers or a distributor or supplier, it is amazing that at the end of the day, when we unpack what we do, why we do it, there's this rally around, we understand that we're not making a product that, is just creating revenue. Like, it is taking care of a person. It is taking care of a person that's taking care of a person, right? From a clinical perspective. So with kind of starting there, with that being said, as complex as that seems, the challenges we're really, at a foundational level, unpacking and addressing start with visibility. Can you see your data? Can you see it in a timely manner? Can you translate that data into a decision? Go up another level. Can you see your partner's data? Can your partner see your data? Do you really know what each other are doing? Do you know and have a collective joint strategy? And if I get a little bit more specific, like, okay, cool, what does that mean? That's foundational. It's general, arguably high level. What it means in practicality is, let's align on what makes the supply chain tick, right? Like, what makes the supply chain move? So, how do organizations manage their product information? How do you manage cross-references? How do you manage how you order? How do you manage how you manage inventory? How do you manage your reorder points, your stocking levels? How do you manage those things? And it's imperative to have that strategy internally and to have the data and the systems surrounded to ensure that you're actually executing against a strategy. Oftentimes we talk to organizations, what's your inventory strategy? What's your reorder strategy? What's your cross-reference strategy? And it's like, you kind of peek behind the curtain, or the first time at data, it's like, oh, maybe like over a period of 3, 5, 10 years, we're actually not running our day-to-day supply chain, but how we thought. We might be carrying more inventory than we thought. We might be carrying way less inventory than we thought in some locations. We might be ordering product totally different, right? Than we anticipated. And all these things, at the end of the day, I would say, we have big vision, big mission statements of really integrating the entire industry and enabling organizations to interface in this multi-enterprise ecosystem to solve some of these challenges and to really align around how do you operate in your supply chain. But at the end of the day, if we kind of put all that aside, time and time again, our goals kind of boil down to, we're trying to make a complex world with complex data and complex technologies and bring it back to the basics.
Yeah.
How do you set up your product? How do you think about risk and resiliency? How do you order product? How do you inventory product? If we flip the persona, how do you inventory product as a supplier? How do you bring product into your warehouses and finished inventory locations? How do you ship that product? When do you ship the product? And by bringing organizations together and enabling their data to, for lack of better terms, interact, we get to expose a lot of those opportunities and then translate and move those opportunities into action. So without getting way into the core of our product and some of the applications and so forth that we have, generally, again, we're in reality, we're really trying to just simplify the complex world, and we're trying to make the work easier, the data easier, and take data to action and decision as quick as we can for customers.
Yeah. Yeah.
So,
I mean,
a lot to unpack there, like you said.
Yeah, man. Tons of insights and kind of gold nuggets in there. But to your point, I think it really sets the stage for, not just the work that you're doing, but the underlying issues, right, in the space. And you mentioned about, the connectivity back to the financials, to the P&L, like it's all interconnected, right? Like every conversation is around the cost of healthcare. And this is a component of that, right?
Yeah.
And I think up until this time, we talk about, you mentioned you go into these organizations, you start to ask these really pointed questions from a strategic lens, and then, down into a tactical lens, and you start to see like what gap actually exists there. And, it's easy to kind of then filter back out to like, well, why is this stuff so expensive? Why is the cost of doing business and moving these products from A to B, why is it so complex? How can we, again, to your point, do this better, make the data more actionable? And it kind of all starts with this understanding of not just, the complex world that we live in, but how do we kind of identify the gap that exists at a detailed level, right? And then start to actually make some positive steps forward into closing that gap. So I think that's kind of like a great segue into the next question, which is really like, if you were to poll many organizations, right, specifically within healthcare, it's kind of like, I would argue that many of them kind of underestimate, like how big that gap actually is, right? Like,
sure.
Well, we're pretty good at these specific pieces of the supply chain. And as you get into those companies and start to unpack that, like talk a little bit about what you're seeing at a detailed level, what gaps are really existing, and kind of ultimately like, how are we going to start to bubble that stuff up with, the ability to integrate change, right? Through a platform like yours.
Yep. No, it's a really fair question. And, I think most organizations, I personally am always in between the kind of polar ends of the spectrum of like, are organizations really as far away as they think from like where they are versus where they want to be? Like, is that really a tremendous gap? Or is the gap much closer? It's just hard to see the links between where you're at and where you want to be. So I'm always in between, depending on the day, maybe depending on conversations, like really how big is the gap, or how big is it not? And again, I'll always try to be fair to our industry as much as I can, right? Even though I know we like to, as an industry, we like to be unfair to ourselves, and it's, hey, we're 10 years behind, 20 years behind, pick your decade, right? Like those are common statements, in industry conversations of just so far behind against retail or so far behind against automotive. And in some ways true, but in other ways, arguably those industries don't operate on a single platform that has one lens of connectivity and visibility either. They have just figured out other ways to partner and to bring visibility across those partnerships where it matters the most. Now, is there a reality of the supplier can see, what production looks like on the line for a car manufacturer? Yeah. Is there a reasonable truth to, hey, the suppliers in retail can see when a product's ordered out of the retail store, right? Whether it's a grocery item, a clothing good. Yeah. Yep. Much more visibility, right? In healthcare, can the manufacturer see when their product's used in a surgery and they know exactly what that means in their entire supply chain? Maybe not. So there's a truth to that statement. But typically where we see organizations, if we move away from like specific problems of, hey, I really struggle with getting visibility to back orders or constraints in the supply chain, and kind of those supply disruptions really wreak havoc, first and foremost on the providers, but truthfully, they wreak havoc on the entire supply chain, because as soon as somebody's not getting their product, what are they doing? Making a call, sending an email, sending 10 emails. So it immediately lights the supply chain on fire, right? And oftentimes what we don't know is like, is there really a disruption or not? Especially in that time, that heightened emotion of, I really need to get this product. Yeah. But typically, generally speaking, where we see organizations start their problem statement is they don't trust their data. That could be rooted in like, I don't trust that I've actually set up my product information correctly. Yeah. I don't trust how I order. I don't trust my inventory signals. I don't trust my forecast. I don't like it continues to go and go. And really that next level is like, I might not trust the signal I'm getting from my supplier. Or if you're a supplier, I might not trust the signal I'm actually getting from my customer. Like, do you really need all that product? You just ordered 3 times more than you normally do this week. So like those data accuracy questions, and again, it's not just like, is 2, 2. The number 2 is 2. Like, there's versions of truth to this, which is where it gets tough in the data world. But that's typically where we see organizations start. And, generally speaking, this is my personal opinion. Organizations will never have perfect data. Even the best organizations don't have perfect data. After years and years of investment and focus and more technology and more data, it's still not perfect. So what we really urge organizations to think about is that analogy of, start building the plane while you're flying it type of thing. What we really like to put in front of customers is, we can help clean your data over time or make your data more accurate and more trusted, while we're also helping change the actual operations of supply chain, change how you order, change how you inventory, change how you forecast. And there's a lot of truth to the reasons why. Like, first and foremost, we don't believe organizations have that much time. The world's changing around us. Like, there's not an organization that can say, hey, I need to take 3 years to clean my data, and then I'll figure out how I operate better. It's not how it works.
Right.
If only. The world moves. So that's just another kind of lens where we really urge organizations to think about both, to really think about an approach, a strategy where you can effectively say, okay, I'm changing how I operate. And while I change how I operate, I'm also understanding where might my data be inaccurate, versus doing one or the other, right? And I get it. Like, if you're changing how you operate and you really don't trust your data, you start to lose faith in, like, are you doing the right things? But the reality is the world moves around us, and we kind of have to do both. Like, there's not an organization out there that's going to say, I got to change my data until it's clean. I'm going to make another order. So, that's kind of at the core, if you want to say it that way. One of those core examples of organizations may feel like they're worlds apart from where they are to where they want to be, just from a data infrastructure perspective. The other one that is I think everyone's trying to wrangle right now is the whole AI innovation curve of you see these amazing technologies coming out and being deployed in like a week, and then they become this amazing, awesome company. Especially in the personal world, right? When you move away from the healthcare supply chain, just all the tools, all the things we're exposed to. I think the other day, I was circling something on social media, and it's like, oh, this is where you can buy it. I'm like, oh yeah, I need to remove that from my life. But how to deploy AI inside or automation in general, I don't like to necessarily just bucket on the buzzword there, but how do we really deploy automation? Think about automation in the life of healthcare supply chain. That I do think also brings concern to organizations, where if my data is not accurate, am I automating? Am I just speeding up bad process? Am I speeding up bad data? And we really like to think about, automation isn't just, hey, ChatGPT or Copilot or whatever, right? It's the combination of data, combination of prompts and models and things that you can train, and then an interface that you can interact with, right? If you're thinking about the conversational aspect of automation. But the reality is, what we share with customers, if we've been using automation for a long time in healthcare supply chain, it just felt like logic and rules and algorithms to predict a forecast, so in a lot of scenarios, we try to help customers wrap their head around and not necessarily get caught up in this AI journey, although it's amazing and there's incredible value there. And we could talk for days just about that. It's really harnessing the power, and where do you want to automate? What's going to bring you the most value? And for us to summarize, we look at value in a couple ways. It's bringing resiliency or de-risking the supply chain, and then it's the cost savings and the financial value, which is arguably easier to measure because it's dollars and cents, and something that makes sense to me because of my finance background. But
it always circles back to that anyway. So.
It does. I mean,
we can kind of, lie to ourselves, but we both know that's what it really comes down to. And, it
does. And it comes down to that. Again, I think our supply chain's in a unique position where we have to run the most optimal supply chain, and it has to be the most resilient.
Yeah.
Like there isn't a trade-off. There is not a trade-off to say, well, we need to over-optimize so we can extract the most value and dollars out of our supply chain. But by doing that, we're inevitably going to bring 20% more risk to the end user, to the patient,
exactly.
to the clinician. Like, no, we actually have to balance those two massive levers. And all organizations have their own balance, right? I mean, in kind of their risk tolerance. But at the end of the day, there's not any provider in the country that can say, yeah, I could afford not having a product there when I need it. It's just how much product do I need there when I need it? And what's the best way to get it there? It's an interesting world. There's no doubt. And the pressures on our supply chain are unique. And I think it's important to acknowledge that.
Yeah. I think ultimately, right, to your point, that's the challenge with trying to benchmark yourselves against other industries, because again, to your point, each specific industry has their own balance of, risk and effectiveness or optimization, however you want to position it. I think that's a really fair point. A couple other really great points I think that you made in there, just in terms of kind of, general sense or problem statements, right? This idea of kind of compounding, right? So it's the reactionary nature of saying like, boy, I'm not sure if, this information is accurate. So you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to order 3 times the amount because I'm going to make sure that I'm good, and
just
not understanding
wrong.
not understanding what the ripple of that actually is, right? Because again, we're talking about, a kind of a siloed perspective, right? So again, talking about how do we break those things down. The other part that I really love that you mentioned is that idea again of like the building while flying and not being able to, to kind of get yourself trapped into this analysis paralysis by, taking a 3-year stint to clean out your data and, revamp your governance processes, right? Like that's not possible. But I think one of the things that goes in that same idea, and I'd love to get your perspective on, is again, as you're starting to unpack these things, like, we both know because we've been involved in enough change initiatives that change is slow, right? Mm-hmm. And very messy in most cases, especially the larger the organization. Healthcare would certainly fall under this umbrella. So, how do you kind of balance those conversations around like breaking down these silos, kind of that siloed perspective or, change management aspect, and kind of starting to help organizations, just talk about the change that is absolutely needed, regardless of the size of gap, right? Change management is a huge component of any, sustainable success to this. So what does that look like in your world and your experience? I'd love to get your perspective on that.
Yeah, it's interesting. And, it's arguably just as challenging to execute change management as it is to integrate data, build and design amazing technology, which, for those, and at some level, we're all involved in change management in our personal lives and careers, whether we're leading teams, part of teams, doesn't matter. It is, it's interesting though, when you, even when I make that comment of like, really? Like, it's just as hard to change how we do something as it is to like build the entire thing. And arguably, yes. So in our conversations, just generally speaking with the industry, let alone our customers, where we see organizations really thrive or move the needle and change and being innovative and being able to move quickly is they get very, very, very clear, or we are clear together with them of why. Why are we even focusing on the thing or the area or the supply chain that we're focusing on? And I think it's interesting as well. We see some organizations, and even internally, we do this quite a bit. A practice we've tried to use is there's two ways to think about, like, what problem are you solving? Why is it important? What value is there in solving the problem? If you get clarity on that, the understanding of, okay, why are we going to put ourselves through some version of pain to go from where we're at to where we're going, right? When you start with a clear message, a clear understanding, I'm not going to say it gets easy, but it gets easier. But we've seen organizations, and again, ourselves, we take two approaches. One is understanding the why and the problem and the value of solving that problem, et cetera. The other way to look at it is what happens if we don't. So what happens if organizations don't change how they inventory product, or change how they order, or change how they manage data, or change how they share data with their partners? Like, what happens if we don't change? And it's just frankly, a play on words. It's saying the same thing, just in the inverse perspective. And it oftentimes has brought some like light bulb moments. And, I kind of try even personally to boil it down to, if we're not willing to change, then we're accepting where we're at. That is just how you got to look at the world. It's black and white. Like, if we're unwilling to change, then we have to be okay with where we're at. And typically most organizations aren't okay with where they're at. They want to get better in some way, shape, or form. The way to do it is to go through change. So again, you can probably tell I try to take those complex things and make them very practical and sometimes oversimplified. But we've had a lot of like internal light bulb moments with insurgents and with our team of, hey, if that seems painful, if that seems hard, well, what happens if we don't do it? And oftentimes like, oh, never mind, we got to do it. Let's go figure it out. And again, it's just an inverse perspective, but I think as humans, sometimes that just helps us correlate to, again, why are some of these things important, even when we might not want to really do them? That perspective of what if we don't means sometimes a little bit more. Yeah.
Well, it's a good, kind of gut check on things, right? Like I used to tell people, sometimes, and I'm sure you've experienced this in your lifetime, but that, that TPS report that has to be generated every week. Right. And it's like, well, just don't send it and see what happens. See if somebody comes asking for it, because if they don't, and 3 weeks has gone by, like, guess what? Okay. So
Here's
I really like
sign.
that though. Yeah. It's just, again, it's none of this stuff is easy. There is a very simplistic view of it, right? And the ease comes because it's mired in details. But I like kind of just, again, flipping that script and asking the same question in a different lens, because again, I would imagine, like, even internally, just having sat in on some of those conversations with the team, right? Like, I would imagine asking that same question, even from like a feature set perspective, is probably shed some light on things that you do or do not need to do. And again, why, right? Like, what's the driver behind why we feel the way that we do? So I think that's really spot on. One of the other, aspects in terms of kind of as you see, like, maybe some of these silos that are starting to be created, whether that's internally or, again, like externally across, the kind of landscape of the supply chain. Talk about maybe some more of the kind of longer term impacts of some of those things. Like, what have you seen over the course of, the time that you've spent in the industry? And again, kind of tying that back to, some of the larger scale, more generic problem set, if you will, because I think that's helpful. One, for people to recognize, like, hey, you're not alone. Everybody's dealing with this stuff, right? Yep. Like, and as much as we want to say, we have a vision for the future, we are very much living in today, and most organizations have a tremendous opportunity ahead of them to improve, right? Yep. To something. To your point. Yep. So,
yeah, it's And we actually did this exercise a little bit as a team here in the past couple months. And, it's easy to get, I'm going to say, caught up in the day to day. Not in our world, that's a bad thing, but it's easy to get, for us, like laser focused on a customer or a kind of a problem or a use case. And it's like, we get laser focused on like, well, what's the value of solving that? And we, start doing math and all this stuff.
Yeah.
And okay, go deliver this value, whether it's optimization of time or inventory or order dollars or compliance or spend, whatever it is. And, there's big dollars, big opportunities, a lot of impact to make. But we went through this exercise the last couple of months and we kind of zoomed out, right? And it's like, in aggregate, what are we looking at? It's sometimes hard or difficult to understand, like, how big is healthcare or how big is our healthcare supply chain? And not to necessarily just like ramble through a bunch of numbers, but it's like when we think about, healthcare in the US is roughly 17 or 18% of GDP. Like, really? Those are some huge numbers, right?
Yeah.
I mean, we're not talking billions, we're talking trillions.
Yep.
And let's say, arguably supply chain, depending on kind of what market or segment you're thinking about, is, 30% of that. Like, okay, the healthcare supply chain is still pretty massive. Like, we're still talking, trillions of dollars of spend and revenue and, things that go into it. And when we start to generalize, like, well, what are conservative, like, estimates of waste? Like, how much is wasted, regardless of like the specific use case or area. But when we start bringing in like, oh, there's 10 to 25% of waste, again, depending on perspective, and a pretty broad range there. But regardless, it's still hundreds of billions of dollars.
Even if it was 1%, which we know it's not, right?
When we think about, again, to your point, when we think about the magnitude at which the small changes can add up to be big impacts at an org level, at a relationship level with partners, and then when we start scaling that up to the industry level, ultimately, if we kind of take the surgeon's lens at that, really what we're doing is we're solving a use case for a customer with the ability then to scale that to other providers, other suppliers, et cetera. We oftentimes say to most of our organizations, like, we could be the last integration you do. We're the last time you have to send data to your suppliers, or for a supplier, it's the last time you have to send data in bespoke fashion to your providers. So we're taking proven use cases to essentially say, hey, who's next? Who wants to use this next? We already have the roadmap. We already have the pipeline. We already have the game plan. And you go from one use case to the next use case in a much more expedient cycle time, right? It's not, hey, I did this one project if I'm a provider, I did this one project with a supplier. I want to do that same thing with my partner. It's like, well, we got to integrate data again. We got to set up the same team. We got to do this. It's like, we don't have years to make this change. Yeah. And that's really what it's taking today, right? So again, to kind of go zoom out and drill back in, the magnitude of opportunity is pretty amazing. And when we think about ultimately the why is it important, the reality is healthcare is being pressured on the revenue side in many ways. The costs that go into healthcare, not just the supply chain, let's just say, aren't going down. They are going up, which is, in the provider space, is really creating this pinch point as the end user customer, like in any other industry, is being pinched between pricing or revenue and the cost to run their businesses. That pinch kind of drives back up through supply chain, and kind of our stance is the industry is for a very long time focused on contracts and price. And it is incredibly important. You have to have a fair price for the right product. Yeah. But we've also heard a lot of organizations through all the segments say, at what point have we squeezed everything we can out of a contract or out of a price? And that is really where, we would like to see, and where we're urging the shift to go from squeezing the contracts and squeezing the price to say, how can we help organizations just think about operating their supply chain different? Almost, that whole analogy of instead of slicing up the pie differently, it's like, how do we make the pie bigger? Or how do we go to a different pie and say, the prices are what they are and the contracts are what they are. How do we actually bring each other value by operating our businesses differently, by moving product differently, by ordering product differently? And that's really exposing a lot of those opportunities. And the organizations that are taking that step or doing that dance together, it's pretty amazing at the opportunities and some of that value realization that's within their orgs, right? But also that bigger value, that bigger scale is when they really start to look outside their organizations and think about how to scale those solutions holistically across their relationships.
I got such a great
Sorry, I weaved in and out. I went industry
this
down.
Is really good. It really kind of sets up to me where we could go in part 2 of this, and so sure. I don't want to get too ahead of myself because it's just a lot of what you unpacked is really insightful. Especially around this idea where, again, I say not many things are new, right? So it's if we're talking about, from a pure analytics perspective, right? Like we've been doing analytics, we've been doing, S&OP, we've been doing SIOP, we've done all of this stuff, right? This stuff isn't new, but it very much is about, to your point, kind of, not just about how we slice and dice it, but how do we introduce something completely new in that infrastructure and then utilize that ultimately to, increase effectiveness, which then starts to cascade and impact all aspects, right? So that's where we're going for the next episode. So I'm not gonna dive deeper into that. I'll kind of leave that as the tease. But I think maybe as we kind of come to the close on this episode, maybe just a summarization. If you kind of had to say or simplify it even further for folks, as we unpacked a lot in this episode, what would you say is kind of like the biggest challenge for leaders in healthcare to kind of understand and acknowledge before we can start to have this next conversation, which is like, what's the day-to-day really like? How do we get into the weeds with this stuff? How do we start to enact real change? What would you say that would be?
Oh, it's a really fair and really hard question. I think the biggest challenge, and I'm probably, as I think about, when you had asked what challenge what's that singular challenge leaders may face, trying to zoom out, get away from understanding AI or how to deploy automation or how to manage talent and the next generation of talent. So zooming out a little bit farther than that, I think leaders within organizations, ultimately, I think we have to assess the willingness of our organizations to strategically change. And maybe if I add one layer to that, are organizations willing to take an honest look at themselves and say, we have to change? If we want different results, we have to change. If, what we see and the reality is organizations will change in ways, even if they haven't addressed that. But the organizations that have made a steadfast commitment to, we are willing to change to do this, this, and this, which is different than what we're doing today, everything kind of flows into that. So, a lot of us as leaders don't have the opportunity to call it set the tone at an organizational level. We have the ability to set the tone at department or team or parts of the organization level. But I think that's where it kind of starts. And we talked about a little bit of that, Dave, of what's the problem? What's the value to the problem? What's the why? Or what's the why not? Or what happens if we don't? But I really think leaders, and we see this all the time, I think the leaders that are willing to take the position within their organization of, if we want X, Y, or Z in our future, we have to be able to change to get there. And then start backing into what do we need to change and why is it important to change? But starting with the plan or the vision versus, conversely, we see organizations say, hey, we have this like new Lamborghini, this new toy. What do we do with it? It's like, well, now you're kind of like, you got this cool widget that you just had to have in a store. And you're like, well, how do I use this thing? Versus, hey, here's our game plan. And again, you don't need it to be perfect, but you need a willingness at an organization level to be accepting of change and accepting of at least challenging the status quo. That's where I would start.
Man, it's again, just so much in there. I gotta ask you a follow up to this because I think we've both been around, long enough and have experienced and been in enough conversations. But what I really love to find out from your perspective is what are some of those characteristic traits of those top leaders that are really good at doing that? Because I think what's challenging for folks that are leading teams, leading departments, maybe leading, a subsidiary is to have those conversations, to identify those characteristics, to understand, is this an org that I can grow within and grow into, right? And I think there are certainly signs of those things. So I'd just love to hear your take on that, having been in, a variety of leadership positions, been in a variety of leadership conversations. I'd love to just get a quick peek into that from your perspective.
Yeah, it's interesting. Within organizations, it's the leaders that we that I've experienced are successful in kind of the innovation realm, right? Like, how do you address change? How do you get motivation behind change? And some of the audience may not like me saying this, but I've experienced the leaders that have the characteristics of what I would say a great salesperson is. Right? The ability to sell a vision and to get buy-in to why it's important and how it's going to impact the organization. And maybe secondarily to that, the leaders that are good storytellers. And not that they're telling a fictional story, but they're telling a story with a picture that other leaders within the organization can understand. They understand the value of. So the art of storytelling, I think, is I don't remember anything in my academia background where that was a training that I got and received in any class. But the art of storytelling, the art of being able to create that vision. And again, it kind of has that like selling type feel. And I think we have to acknowledge there's a lot of selling that goes on. Not from a supplier to a provider, but within the supplier, within the provider,
internally,
and selling your vision, selling why it's important, selling why it's valuable, selling why it must need to be done. And I think from a quality or characteristic perspective, it's the combination of that and where we see orgs get a lot of traction or leaders get a lot of traction is when I'm not going to say they've done the work, but when they can relate to the work that they're talking about transforming. Especially, I think there's a lot of trust built in the operational setting when the leader can say, hey, I've been in warehouses. I've been in the PAR locations. I've been ordering and or on the receiving dock. I see the problems. Might not have done them my whole life. Might not have done them my whole career. But that combination of being able to paint the picture, paint the vision, tell the story, and also bring it to that like tactical, tangible level. There are some leaders in the industry that amaze me because they have both sides of that down and they can tell the story, but it's rooted in truth and it's rooted in reality. I try to embody that when I see it. But I think the combination of those couple characteristics are really igniting some of the organizations and some of the departments within those organizations, igniting the innovation pretty fast.
Yeah. That's awesome, man. And, I agree. I think ultimately, this idea around storytelling, sharing that vision, and again, letting that, infiltrate the organization, because at kind of the most simplistic form, right? What we're really doing is sharing ideas back and forth and trying to find some common ground, right? Like,
Yep.
and so we need those perspectives. We need to have, an intimate level of trust amongst our team, across our organization, to really have any kind of chance at getting some of this stuff not only started, right, but ultimately sustained,
Yes.
and to continue to build upon it. So, Cody, man, this has been really great. I really appreciate your time. I'm excited to dive into part 2 of this, where we're going to kind of get into, the tactical day-to-day, like what's it really like living in the weeds of this stuff. So I think folks will really appreciate that. For anybody that wants to connect with you, where's the best place for them to reach out and have a conversation with you?
Oh, well, first and foremost, thank you, Dave. Enjoyed part 1. Looking forward to part 2. Can't believe how fast it went.
Yeah, man.
Anyone that wants to link up, and Dave, I'll echo your point here. This all starts with conversation, perspective, different ideas. Personally, I love having those in the industry, and kind of what's the art of the possible? How do we think outside the box? All that fun stuff. But on LinkedIn, you can search me. Happy to connect there. Probably the easiest way from a personal level. From a business level, wearesurgeons.com. We got a website. Anybody can reach out there, and team will follow up quickly if there's any interest. And again, that doesn't have to necessarily be interest in the product, but always open for collaborative discussion and again, kind of that problem solving mentality. So.
Yeah, love it. Well, I'll make sure to put those links in the show notes. And again, thanks so much for coming on the Everyday Business Problems podcast.
Absolutely. Thanks, Dave. Been a pleasure.
Thank you so much for listening today. If we brought you any value, please rate, subscribe, and share our podcast. Also, be sure to connect with us on social media by searching @The Crysler Club. Until next week, I'm your host, Dave Crysler.